Okay, hi everyone, welcome back, and yeah, I hope you had a really relaxing 3-day weekend. So class isn't starting quite yet, but before we start class, I'd like to do a little announcement presented by the Huiola Pono Club. And this is a club that public health associated with the School of Public Health, and it's a interest club in public health and health professions.
Everybody, my name's Kelsey and I'm here to talk to you about Huiola Pono. Huiola Pono is the public health club at UH Manoa, and we focus on public health outreach, education, and fundraising in the university and Hawaii communities. So it's designed for public health students, but it is open to all majors, so you and your friends are free to join. This is our Spring 22 board members. So Cameron is our president, Brandy is our vice president, Kristen is our secretary, I'm the events coordinator, Chelsea is the treasurer, Cindy is our fundraising chair, and Akanksha is our social media coordinator. Why should you join our Hui? So we have lots of community outreach and service opportunities advertised to our members, and we also have community service events where we go out as a group. There's in-person and virtual opportunities as well. We also have lots of scholarship, internship, and fellowship opportunities advertised to us, which we make known to our Hui members. We have professional development events where we invite keynote speakers in the public health field to talk about their specialties, and this is how you can build connections and networks. These are some past in-person event photos. So this is a picnic and a hike that we went to as a social event. And then these are some past volunteering events where we volunteered at Alo'i and the Hypha Estuary. So for our club, we have something called active status. To achieve active status, you have to attend a minimum of 5 different events, 4 general meetings, and the undergraduate summit. The undergraduate summit is where public health majors present on their practicum topics. And for the minimum of 5 events, you have to get 1 event in each category. So there's community service, professional development, and social events. There are benefits to achieving active status. So for seniors who achieve active status, they get a graduation cord. And then also for the non-graduating members, there is an end of year semester celebration and you get a goodie bag. For all seniors graduating, there are public health stoles available for purchase for you to wear at your ceremony. And then this is our membership form. So feel free to scan the QR code or go to the Google form link below. And this is how you can sign up to become a member. It is free to join since there are no dues. And this is also how you get subscribed to our biweekly newsletter. This is how you can stay updated and connected with us. We have our Instagram, which is at Public Health Hui. Our biweekly newsletters is where you'll get all the information about upcoming opportunities and events. And we have a Discord for members to socialize with each other, as well as for us to remind you about upcoming events. And we have our Hui website, which is publichealthhui.weebly.com. We have our first general meeting on Thursday, January 20th from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. on Zoom. We'll have the Zoom link emailed to everybody who signs the membership form. It'll be in our biweekly newsletter, and we'll also send out another email reminder when it comes closer. So thank you so much for listening, and this is how you can stay connected with us again. Our Instagram is Public Health Hui, and our website is publichealthhui.weebly.com. Scan the QR code for the membership form, and feel free to email us at holopono@hawaii.edu if you have any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kelsey, and I'll have the information posted after class if you're interested in the Huiola Pono Club. Now we're in our second week of class, and you'll have your first Tophat assignment released this week. So if you haven't signed up for Tophat already, again, this is both the platform we're using both for the non-quiz assignments and the non-packback stuff. So there will be a FAQ also released on Tophat. But again, that first week for people to kind of try before they commit to this class. But you should be able to enroll in that Tophat class if you're already there. And again, the link is on Lima as well. But yes, for And the syllabus says this class will be entirely online. At least for PHYL 142 lecture, it will be entirely online. So we're not moving back in person. So yeah, it's fully online for the rest of the, it was from start to begin, and it was always intended to be online, at least for spring 2022. All right, so if you have Tophat already and you want to participate, I have some questions to get us warmed up for the semester. So again, new semester, new class, new join code. So the join code in our class code for Tophat is a new one, so it's a new 6-digit one. It's also in the syllabus as well, and you can also click the link and just search for our class in Tophat if you're not signed up for our classroom already. And if you have, there are some other professors that use that Tophat as well, and supposedly like the same Tophat Pro subscription can be used for multiple classes as well. So you shouldn't have to, if you already have Tophat from something that in the current class you have for this semester, you shouldn't need to register again. All right. Now before we get to that, let's go with our presentation for today. So we're continuing with the endocrine system, and yes, I know I take my time with the endocrine system because the endocrine system is powerful, but it can be potentially complicated, or it is complicated, but it's really exciting. All right, so we talked about hormones and different types of hormones and how they're generally transported in the cell and what they do to cells very generally. Now we're going to talk about specific hormones from this point on. So what controls hormones? So how do we know when to make hormones and how do we know when to turn them off? That is the aim of the lectures this week. Well, these are different ways of controlling the hormones that you produce in your body. So it involves these structures in your brain called the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Now, not all hormones are regulated by this, but many of them are controlled by the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. And this is from the Martini version of the book. It looks very complicated, but let's look at this part right here. Sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla, and then you go have these preganglionic motor fibers going to the adrenal medulla, and then you have this secretion of these two chemicals called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And hopefully, if you've taken last semester's or Human Anatomy and Physiology 1, this sounds familiar, right? We did cover this in PHYL 141 when we talked about sympathetic activity and the neurotransmitters released by the sympathetic nervous system. Now, let's talk about something and put it in context. We talked about it, in terms of neurotransmitters and activating the fight or flight system, but now we're going to talk about something called general adaptation syndrome. So, what is general adaptation syndrome? Well, it involves stress, and sometimes it's called the stress response as well, or sometimes acute stress response. There's different names for this, but this is the term used in the OpenStax textbook. So there are 3 general phases, and the first phase, when you first encounter the stress, is called an alarm reaction. So alarm reaction is your initial reaction, and it's kind of like what we typically associate with our fight or flight system, right? So why? Because it involves sympathetic activity, and then it releases stress hormones such as that epinephrine and norepinephrine we just talked about. Now, the thing about the general adaptation syndrome is it has multiple stages. So what if this, say you have a briefly stressful situation, you're trying to run and do a quick sprint and go to safety real quick. Well, once that stress is gone and you don't have that stressor anymore, then you just go back to how you were before you activated that sympathetic activity. But say you're still encountering stress and it's no longer just a brief period, but now it starts to be a little, it lasts a little longer than just that momentary reaction. So as time goes on and you still encounter that stress, what happens is that you start to enter the resistance phase. So the thing with the sympathetic activity is that you're increasing your overall metabolic activity and physical activity and mental activity. So you're releasing all these nutrients and burning up a lot of your energy reserves. But the resistance phase is when it starts to try to compensate for that because, again, stress is very taxing on the body and also you're consuming a lot of nutrients. So resistance phase is starting to increase parasympathetic activity and digestive system activity because why? Well, if you're using up your energy, you have to refuel somehow, right? So this is why the parasympathetic, again, If it innervates the same organ, sympathetic and parasympathetic tend to counteract each other, but you can have levels of one be in the background. So with an alarm reaction, we have a lot of sympathetic activity, but as we enter resistance, we start to have more parasympathetic activity. Because why? Again, that sympathetic activity is using up a lot of your reserves as well. And then what we go here is like now we have the prolong. So what if this stress keeps on going, and eventually, if it keeps on getting drawn out and prolonged, maybe kind of like this pandemic, you might enter something called the exhaustion phase. And what's the exhaustion phase? Well, it's when the stress occurs past this resistance phase, and now all of the hormones, like if you're keeping on cranking out all the hormones associated with the sympathetic activity, like there are many hormones, especially epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, which we'll talk about a lot in the next few lectures. Well, they can cause negative effects if they're staying in your system at high levels for too long. And there are many things, like they have negative effects on your energy reserves, they have negative effects on your cardiovascular system. This is why sometimes people have more things like increased risk of heart attacks if they're entering the exhaustion phase. And the thing about cortisol is also that it's an anti-inflammatory hormone, but also suppresses your immune system. So you have the stress and you're trying to deal with all the stressful situations, but if it's drawn out for too long, you can start to have negative effects from being exposed to these stress hormones for too long. Now, with sympathetic activity, what we have here is that, okay, remember the whole fight or flight system, and remember that limbic system if you were here for last semester? Well, remember that the amygdala or the amygdaloid body, very important in emotional responses, especially in fear responses. So in the example of this sympathetic activation with the general adaptation syndrome, we have the amygdala responding to some sort of stress, and then it's sending signals to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system by sending action potentials and these signals along sympathetic nerve fibers. And these nerve fibers, well, the sympathetic nervous system, again, is more than just the adrenal glands, but for this example, we're talking about the general adaptation syndrome. But some of these fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are going to go to the adrenal medulla. And then the adrenal medulla, in response to all this nervous system activation along sympathetic pathways, is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, or also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline respectively. Yeah, so that is a little review of the sympathetic nervous system, and it comes in handy because why? Well, where does this epinephrine and norep go? It goes into the bloodstream, therefore now these are hormones. And we're talking about hormones and we're talking about the endocrine system. So it's kind of a little bridge between the sympathetic, or between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Let's see, and communicate. Yeah, so I mean, you're free to communicate with however, but yeah, if I had moderators that were like more 24/7, but I don't have a Discord right now. Don't have time to really create one right now. Okay. So let's go here. So now we're talking about the endocrine system, but it's not just the sympathetic activity. Here, let's look at the other parts of that previous figure. So what we have here are regulatory hormones going between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And where's the hypothalamus? Well, it's this part right here. So this is the hypothalamus and this is the pituitary gland. So this is very important in regulating a lot of hormones in your body. Not all of the hormones, but many of them are controlled by these two parts of your brain. Now with the pituitary gland, notice that this pituitary gland has two main lobes, and in other organisms and creatures they have something called the intermediate lobe, but in humans we have two main lobes, the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. And these lobes secrete hormones. And what are these hormones? Well, we'll get to that. But now let's talk about our first top hat question. So let's go here. And with our first top hat question. So with top hat questions, if they're live, for people watching this later, don't worry, you're not going to lose out on points. Again, top hat questions are asked live. If you get it right, great for you. And if you don't get it right, then that doesn't count against you. They're just for fun, so again, low stakes here. All right, so flashback. And if you weren't here for PHYL 141, you might have trouble with this, but what is this bone? And with all Tophat questions, if you can't see it or if you're well enough and you want to zoom in, all you have to do is click the image and it zooms in. And if you want to collapse again, just click it again and it collapses it. Okay, let's see the responses. So it seems split between ethmoid and sphenoid, and this is the sphenoid bone. And again, it's like my favorite way of describing this sphenoid bone. It looks like a winged bone, so sometimes people think it looks like a bat or a butterfly. And yes, these are called greater and lesser wings. And if you don't know what this is, go back to the axial skeleton part of the book. Now, do I expect you to know every single bone in the body at this point? Well, it's like, at this context, I will refer to it because it's important, because this sphenoid bone contains a very important organ and tissue. So that's what we have here. And let's go back. So yeah, again, I'm not going to ask like in all the bone markings on your like radius, ulna, femur, or all these other things, but this is a very important bone because why? It has a very important gland. So this part you can't really see from this angle, but if you look at the top of it, it has something called the sella turcica. And that's where you find the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is nestled in this small little bony cavity. And then this is what we have here. So this pituitary gland, this fits right into this sphenoid bone. So your pituitary gland is protected by this layer of bones. And this is where we see what we see here. So here's the hypothalamus. Here's the pituitary gland with its anterior and posterior lobe. And here's the sphenoid bones. So again, your pituitary gland is not just dangling in the middle of a bunch of just empty space and cerebrospinal fluid. It's actually protected by this bone. And this is why if someone develops a pituitary tumor, where do they have to go? Well, often they have to go, like a common route of surgery is going past the orbit. So they go past the eye without puncturing the eye, because that's very important. But yeah, this is why it's also tricky to do surgery on this, because it's really central to your skull and brain. Okay, so then why am I making such a big deal about the pituitary gland? Well, this is why sometimes it's also nicknamed the master gland. Why? Because this pituitary gland right here secretes all of these hormones over here, and those hormones target all these glands, which also produce some of their own hormones. So this is why it's sometimes called the master gland. It's not an official term, but you might see it here referred to often, because why? It is a master of many of these hormones, and it involves and regulates and controls all these hormones. Are these all the hormones in the body? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. If you think this is complex, there are more hormones out there, but it does control a lot of hormones in your body. Now, here's vasculature and some of the neurons and neural wiring with the pituitary gland, hypothalamus, and the blood vessels that supply this. The blood vessels are depicted here by these red and blue lines right here. Now I'm going to break this down for you. This is more for your reference, especially if you're using the slides. But these are definitely what I want you to know. So let's take a little more of these details away. I mean, these nuclei are important maybe if you're going to like advanced A&P, or if you're going to medical school, you probably will have to learn these nuclei. But in terms of this class, let's start with this. So again, this is anterior and posterior, showing anterior here, posterior there. And if you're new to PHYL 141, go to chapter 1. You need to know your anatomical directions. So if you were looking at a person's hypothalamus and pituitary, we're kind of looking like a sagittal section, but they're looking off this way. So the anterior would be this way, posterior would be that way. So with the posterior, let's talk about the posterior lobe. So there's two main lobes, but the posterior lobe is actually, I think, the more easier to explain and less complicated one. So there's an anterior lobe, but let's start with the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe, there are these nuclei, and again, if you remember from last semester, that a nucleus in terms of the central nervous system is a group of cell bodies, and they share a common function. Again, this is kind of like, I italicize it because not that it's not important, but for advanced classes it might be important, but for this class I focus on it a little less. But what I'm getting at here is that you have all these neurons, and these neurons, they're sending their axons, and then they have their axon terminals synapsing upon, or actually I should say, like, they're now branching in and they're connected to these arteries and blood vessels in the posterior pituitary lobe. Now what they're going to do is secrete chemicals. So just like how if we have like a neuron to neuron synapse, you have the presynaptic neuron secreting neurotransmitters onto a postsynaptic cell or a postsynaptic neuron. But in this case, we have a neuron secreting chemicals, but now it's going to go directly into the bloodstream. So these chemicals secreted by the neurons, these are going to be carried into the bloodstream and again, you have this blood going into the posterior lobe. But now this blood is going to continue out of the posterior lobe and now to the rest of the body. And this is what we have here. It's kind of interesting too, because like arteries and veins, they have anatomical definitions, but they also have directional definitions, and we'll get more into that. I think for Unit 2, that's when we talk more about arteries and veins, but just letting you know, like, it's not the same vessel. Like artery, in this terms of hypophyseal artery, it's going into the posterior lobe, and this hypophyseal vein is carrying these chemicals away and out of the posterior lobe. So it's kind of like coming here, picking up these chemicals, and now it's leaving the posterior lobe. Okay, so let's go to our second Tophat question. And here's a little thing. So now we're talking about those chemicals, and they're being secreted by these neurons from that start in the hypothalamus, but now they're extending their axons into the pituitary gland, secreting chemicals into the bloodstream. So these chemicals that we saw depicted as those green blobs earlier, are these now neurotransmitters, hormones, both, or neither? Okay. All right, let's see the responses. Okay, right here, so it seems split between like they are hormones and they are both neurotransmitters and hormones. Well, once these chemicals hit the bloodstream, now they are hormones. So it's possible for a same chemical to be a neurotransmitter or hormone, but it depends on context. I'll explain shortly. Alright, so why is it considered a hormone? Well, endocrine signaling is that remember that blood is the primary carrier of hormones, and hormones can be theoretically distributed anywhere in the body. Why? Because blood needs to be distributed everywhere in your body. So with classic endocrine signaling, you have some sort of endocrine cell secreting a hormone, and this is carried via the bloodstream to a distant target tissue, cell, or organ. Now, neurosignaling, what we have are neurotransmitters, and they're secreted across the synapse onto some sort of target cell or another neuron. And this is why neurotransmitters are very selective, and it's supposed to be very direct and not spread out throughout the body. It's supposed to be located within this synapse. I mean, some can diffuse out of that synapse, but in terms of the scope, this is global and this is specific. Now with neuroendocrine signaling, I know this is what they talk about, but in terms of its definition, it is endocrine signaling, but this cell that's secreting the hormone is a neuron. But instead of this neuron secreting directly onto a cell, this neuron is secreting into the bloodstream, and this can be carried throughout the body, and then once it binds to a receptor to a cell somewhere else in the body, it carries that signal and activates and causes changes in that cell. So again, it depends. Is it a synapse? Then it's a neurotransmitter. If it's being secreted into the bloodstream, it's a hormone. Now the same chemical structure, like you can't have the same chemical being either a neurotransmitter or a hormone. It just depends on what context. Is it being at a synapse, or is it being in the bloodstream? Alright, so here's our posterior secretion. So yes, this is neuroendocrine signaling. So even though neurons are involved, it's not secreting directly onto a target cell. These chemicals being secreted by these neurons, they're going into the bloodstream, and now these are being carried out to the rest of the body via these hypophyseal veins. And there are two hormones that are two main hormones that are produced and secreted into the posterior pituitary lobe, and these hormones are oxytocin and ADH. So So those are the two main ones. So look, this is why it's like relatively simple with the posterior pituitary lobe. It's sometimes called neurohypophysis, but I'll probably call it, for this class I just call it the posterior pituitary. But if you're taking advanced classes or looking at other textbooks or looking at journals, you might see this term. So there's ADH, also known as vasopressin, or actually ADH is a abbreviation for antidiuretic hormone. And then what it does is inhibits diuresis, and we'll get to more of that later. And then there's also oxytocin, often abbreviated OXT, and these are the two main posterior pituitary hormones. So again, they're not secreted in the anterior, they're secreted in the posterior. And this is very important with trust and social bonding and relationships. But let's talk more about ADH. So again, commonly called vasopressin. It's a small peptide hormone, so it's only made out of 9 amino acids, and it actually does a little loop via its cysteine residues, but that's more like, you don't need to know the cysteine part for this class, maybe in advanced classes maybe. But it is a peptide hormone, so it's easily dissolvable and soluble in the bloodstream, and it's very tiny and can be carried to many tissues. But it's also very important in regulating diuresis, which is the process of producing urine. So this is a very important term to know if you're going to nursing, medicine, pharmacology, because why? There's a category of drugs called diuretics. And what do diuretics affect? Well, they're going to affect the production of urine. So if you have some diuretic, it's going to increase the production of urine. Now, what we have here, all these people, yeah, they're in the process of diuresis, or maybe some of them, but at least, some of them are going to be in the process of trying to do diuresis. But ADH is antidiuretic hormone. So if diuresis is producing urine, if you have antidiuretic hormone, this is going to decrease the production of urine. So what happens when you decrease the production of urine? Well, where does that water and fluid go? It stays in your body. So antidiuretic hormone is very important in conserving and retaining water in your body. So if you have ADH, you're not going to want to use the restroom, because why? This is antidiuretic hormone. So you're not going to want to produce a lot of urine, therefore you won't want to go to the bathroom as often. So why? Because you're trying to conserve water and retain it. So antidiuretic hormone, one of its main functions is to decrease your water content in your urine. Should you study up on other details are in the Martini textbook, or stick what's within the lecture? So focus what's in the lecture, and like things like, phospholipase C, diacylglycerol, IP3. That one is more for like advanced classes. Like I don't go too much on molecular pathways in this class, for at least for G proteins. I want you to know that they're often receptors for hormones, but in terms of those like secondary messengers, that's what they call it. I think that's more for advanced AMPs. So I don't really concentrate on, like med students, they gotta know what phospholipase C, diacylglycerol, and also IP3, they gotta know that stuff. But for 142, I don't concentrate on that. Not that it's not important, but that's like another layer of detail. Okay, so what will ADH do? It decreases your urine production and decreases your water content in urine. So it will change your urine content by reducing the amount of water in your urine. So here's a very dilute, pale, light yellow urine sample. So if you add ADH to this equation, well, the ADH is going to target the kidneys, and the kidneys are going to reabsorb more water from your urine. So if that water doesn't end up in your urine, you end up with a more concentrated urine product. And what happens when your urine is more concentrated? Well, the color also gets concentrated as well. So now this is why if you have a lot of ADH in your body, it's going to result in darker urine, because that ADH is trying to tell your kidneys to reserve water and not pee it out and you do diuresis. Therefore, that water stays in your system. It doesn't end up in your urine. Now with ADH, what triggers ADH to be produced? Many stimuli can be, and do you have to know every single stimulus that can increase ADH? Just know that this is where, rather than memorizing a list, I'd rather you focus on what is the purpose of ADH. The purpose of ADH is to conserve water and retain water in your body. So what are situations that might warrant your body to, or tell your body, like, would be advantageous for your body to hold on to water. So things like this, remember osmolarity, and osmolarity will definitely come back, especially for Unit 3, the final of this final third of the semester, because why? We talk about the kidneys and we talk about osmolarity. And actually it comes in, yeah, you should just know osmolarity. If you forgot what it is, go back to my osmosis lecture or go to, I think it was it might be chapter 3 of the book as well. Go over osmosis. But say you have a real high solute concentration, so a lot of salt, a lot of sugars, or you just have a lot of things floating around, a high concentration of things dissolved in your bodily fluids compared to the water. So very salty, very sugary. So you have high osmolarity. And what does that do when you have a high solute concentration in the fluids of your body and in your blood? Well, that's going to draw water out of your cells. So again, just like when you have preserves or you have something like you're pickling something, you have a high salt or sugar concentration, that draws water out because salt and sugars are very attractive to water and vice versa. So this is drawing all this water out of these cells. So with the high osmolarity, well, that means you have too much solute compared to your solvent, which is water. So how can you increase your water? Well, one way you can increase your water in your body is to produce a lot of ADH. So what happens with ADH? ADH is going to shunt the water away from your urine because again, if you're kind of dehydrated, yep, someone said extreme dehydration over here. Instead of the water going to your urine, now you're going to retain and hold on to this water because why? You want to rehydrate these cells that are losing a lot of water. So if you're very dehydrated and have high osmolarity in your blood or bodily tissues, this is going to make the water rehydrated. So this is why if you're dehydrated, you're probably going to produce a lot more ADH. Sympathetic activity as well. Why? Well, remember that sympathetic activity tends to oppose the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? So remember that sympathetic is that classic fight or flight or flight and freeze. And then we have our rest and digest system with our parasympathetic nervous system. And remember that diuresis and producing urine is part of the parasympathetic activity. So with sympathetic activity, it's not time to really use the restroom because why? You're trying to deal with that stressor or whatever is causing that sympathetic activity. So why is it advantageous to produce a lot of urine? Not really. So this also helps to reduce the amount of urine you're producing so that there are less urges to go to the restroom and do diuresis. And then other hormones and other signals from other organs can also increase ADH, and there are many of them. Do I want you to memorize the list? Not really. But I'm trying to kind of let you know that a lot of times these hormones don't work in isolation. Often other hormones affect other hormones, and you have all these complex networks of hormones. So again, these don't work in just their own lane. Often these hormones work together to produce a coordinated response in your body. Okay, so antidiuretic is preventing urination, right? So this guy right here is exercising. So what happens to ADH levels when you exercise? What do you think happens? And let's go back to Tophat. So let's keep this pretty simple. What do you think happens to ADH when you exercise? Does it go up? Does it go down? Or is it unaffected? And yes, when the quizzes are done with their beta testing, I'll release them and you have unlimited tries. So yeah, quizzes on Lalima, you have unlimited tries and they're due by the exam that they correspond to. All right, let's see the responses. So most of you said that you produce more. So the second place we have produce less, and a minority said that they remain the same. The correct answer is that you produce more ADH, and why I'll explain. Now let's talk about this. So what happens to ADH levels? Well, remember that ADH, the A and D stands for antidiuretic, right? So you're preventing urination. But what happens when you exercise? Well, you're also losing a lot of water, and this guy's like super sweaty and he's super dripping, so he's losing a lot of water. And also when he's breathing, this is why your mouth gets dry when you exercise and you don't hydrate as well, right? Because you're also breathing out a lot of water vapor. So basically with exercise, you're losing water. And as you lose water, you're having an increased solute concentration, again, those salt, sugars, and proteins that contribute to osmolarity. Well, now your bodily fluids are getting more concentrated, and it's because why? You're losing water. It's kind of like when you're making soup and then you leave it on the stove and then it starts to boil off all the water. As it boils off all the water and has less water, it gets more concentrated. Same principle, sort of. Alright, so how can ADH maintain water and osmolarity? Remember that ADH, what does it do? It conserves water and retains water. Well, if you increase ADH, you're going to have more water retention. If you decrease ADH, you're going to lose water because why? The ADH is kind of like the brakes on urination. So if you decrease ADH, you're removing the brakes. Now you're free to urinate and lose water. Well, what do we want to do in this situation? We're losing water. And what also do you do during or after exercise? What do they always tell you to do, especially if you're exercising or being outdoors for a long time? You're going to get the urge to drink because why? You're losing all this water. So by drinking water, what are you doing? You're introducing water back into your body. But what's your way? Say you can't drink and you can't introduce new water to your body. You want to hold on to whatever water you have and limit your losses. So this is why ADH increases, because why? It's preventing further loss of bodily fluids. So this is why as you exercise, your ADH levels will gradually increase, because again, not only that, is exercise sympathetic or parasympathetic? Again, exercise is activating, you're mobilizing your energy reserves, you're burning up a lot of energy. So it's another example of sympathetic activity. And sympathetic activity also increases ADH because why? So yeah, that's what we're having here. So increased ADH results in water retention. Now let's talk about the second posterior pituitary hormone. We have oxytocin. So oxytocin is very important in reproduction and social interactions and also uterine contraction. So this is like, especially not just like in female reproduction, but also male reproduction, but yeah, the uterus in the female reproductive system. So oxytocin, very important in the reproductive system. We'll get more to that in the end of the semester, but this is kind of what I want you to know, just the basics for now. And also when we talk about the mammary glands later on the semester, oxytocin is also involved in ejecting milk from the mammary glands. So this letdown, this milk ejection reflex, oxytocin is also important in that. And it's also interesting too, it's not just about reproduction, but also about social affections and also trust and bonding as well. And this is conserved throughout evolution. So what we see is like, okay, oxytocin, and we see this in chimps, which are very similar to us in terms of our genetic sequences and genomics. But it's also important in psychology and relationships as well. So oxytocin is important in forming social connections, bonding, and trust as well. And it's also interesting too, because they see that like people who have autism, well, they have different ways. The people who are on the autism spectrum, well, they have different ways of like associating, and what they saw is that, okay, with this autistic people who are on the spectrum, they gave them supplemental oxytocin and found that they had more social bonding and connections compared to without the oxytocin. Yeah, so it's very interesting. And but the thing is that the people who sometimes to get grants or sometimes to help with the research, people like to publicize or maybe it's also media and trying to go for clickbait headlines, but you might have heard of oxytocin referred to as the love hormone. So why? Because, well, it's not just hopefully in love you also have some sort of social bonding as well. But is it necessarily about romantic love? Well, oxytocin is also involved in mother-child bonding. So it's not just like the milk ejection letdown, but it's also in social bonding. So not necessarily just mother and child, but also maybe with your friends. But it can be involved in romantic attachment as well, and trust, as in that previous study, and sexual activity as well. So maybe with like a relationship, you might have that, not necessarily in this order. But this is why oxytocin is sometimes branded as a love hormone. It can be like love among family, love among friends, or love with romantic love. So this is what oxytocin, not only in just reproductive activity, but also in forming bonds with other people. And that is the posterior lobe. So posterior lobe is involved, the two main hormones I want you to know from that are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Now in the anterior lobe, so basic hypothalamic-pituitary control. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, very important in regulating the endocrine system, but again, these aren't all the hormones, but it does control many of the hormones. So here's an example of this. Like, this is a very general schematic of how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland work in what we call a hormone cascade. So we have waves of hormones being released in succession, and these hormones are different at different steps of this process. So the first general step with hypothalamic pituitary control is that the hypothalamus secretes a category of hormones we call releasing hormones. So this is the first wave of hormones, and these target the pituitary gland. So when these releasing hormones hit the pituitary gland and bind to receptors on the pituitary gland, then these endocrine cells in the pituitary gland, they're going to release a different second wave of hormones. Sometimes they're called what we call tropic hormones, or sometimes they're also called stimulating hormones. Depends on which type of hormones are being eventually targeted and released. So but the main take-home message is that there's a second wave. And then depending on the type of tropic hormone or stimulating hormone, then you have a third wave of hormone if there is a target organ. And these are the ones that are going to go to the systemic circulation and go throughout the body. Where it targets, it depends on the hormone, depends on the pathway. Because the thing is that there are multiple subtypes, but in general, hypothalamic pituitary control of hormones follows this kind of pattern of a first wave that goes between the hypothalamus and pituitary, can't English today, and then pituitary gland, the second wave going from pituitary gland to some or the other target organ, and then you might have a third wave of hormones being produced by that target organ. Alright, so with the anterior lobe, notice that there's a different entrance. So with the posterior lobe, we had the inferior hypophyseal artery, but now with the anterior, we have a superior hypophyseal artery. So what this is going to do is going to carry those releasing hormones that are bridging the hypothalamus to the pituitary. So they only have a very small distance to go, and they go via these blood vessels we call portal vessels. So these releasing hormones, there are many types, but generally they're known the ones that bridge the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. These releasing hormones will target these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. Now these endocrine cells, there are many subtypes of them, but what will they do? Well, when they're activated by these releasing hormones, they'll release a second wave of hormones, and sometimes they're called tropic hormones, sometimes they're stimulating hormones, or sometimes they're called something else. But the second wave is going to be secreted by these cells located in the anterior pituitary, and now the second wave is going to go via these hypophyseal veins to the rest of the body. So what happens after this? Well, it's going to go to some sort of target organ. And here's an example of a target endocrine organ. We're showing the adrenal glands over here. It's not the only target organ, but for this example, we're going to pick that. So now it's going to go to a third organ, and these tropic hormones are going to cause this target endocrine organ to secrete that third wave. So this is what I'm getting at here. At different steps connecting different tissues, you have different sets of hormones. So you have that first wave that goes from hypothalamus to pituitary, that second wave that goes from pituitary to the target organ, and now you finally have a third wave of hormones. So we see this all the time in the hormones that are controlled by the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Now, what are the hypothalamic releasing hormones that can bridge the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland? Well, there are four main types that I want you to know. So there's the TRH, CRH, GnRH, and GHRH. But this is pretty much why I want you to know that these are released by the hypothalamus and they target the pituitary gland. But with prolactin, now prolactin I put a little asterisk because this is like compared to the other four, It's a relatively new one, and I think both Martini and OpenStax do mention it. But in terms of how it regulates it, it's kind of its own special case, so don't worry too much about that. Know that it exists, but in terms of its specific, it is released by the hypothalamus and does target the pituitary gland. But yeah, they do find it, but it's kind of like one of the bleeding edge things. I think maybe in a few years they might know more about this, but for now, just know it exists. Yeah, so what makes releasing hormones different? Main thing function is that they do have other functions, but their main function is to control and regulate pituitary release of hormones. So releasing hormones, they target the pituitary. That's their main target, not really going to the rest of the body. So yeah, they can enter the systemic circulation, but their main function is to bridge the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So yeah, even though they do enter the bloodstream, their receptors and their main targets are a very short stop away in the pituitary gland. Now with the hypothalamus and pituitary, again, we have our releasing hormones being produced, that long list of 4 plus 1. And now it's going to go to the pituitary gland. And now the pituitary gland has all these different types of endocrine cells. And it's going to produce that second wave of hormones. So what is that second wave of hormones? Well, depends on which releasing hormone is being, which cells are responding to which type of releasing hormone. So thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to bind for the cells in the pituitary gland that have receptors for TRH. They're going to produce a different hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, if it was CRH, if for cells in the pituitary gland that respond to CRH and have receptors for CRH, they're going to produce this hormone called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, GnRH, this is for the cells that have receptors for GnRH, they are going to produce FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Very important later on in the semester. And for GHRH, or growth hormone releasing hormone, is going to trigger the production of growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is a kind of exception to that first, second, and third wave. It only has 2 waves. So growth hormone actually has that. It's very powerful. Like especially if you're interested in if you're in any sort of if interest like in the gym or in PEDs, you probably know what GH is. So that is the same thing, and it has systemic effects because it targets so many cells in the body. So this is actually an exception here to that first and second and third wave. The second wave right here, that's the final product. The target organs all over the body. We'll get more to that later on in the semester or in future lectures. And prolactin, so this is where it gets tricky. Now, I'm just doing this FYI because I don't expect you to know how tricky it is at this point. And this is why I put all these asterisks, because this is what Martini and OpenStax use, but thyrotropin releasing hormone also affects prolactin production. So it's tricky. You have 2 ways, 2 releasing hormones, and they both affect prolactin. And this is like canon. This has been known for over 50 years. So this is a little complicated. Don't worry about it at this level. Maybe if you're going to med school, you might have to worry about that. But for 142, you don't have to worry about that cascade right there. But what I'm getting at there is, okay, these are your anterior pituitary hormones. So these are the ones that are being produced by the anterior pituitary endocrine cells. And as someone said, prolactin is one of those. Again, prolactin is part of the anterior pituitary hormone set. And there's a nice mnemonic I like to use, and I think I came up with this when I first semester of teaching this stuff. But active teens prefer getting free lunches, and yeah, I mean it's been a while, but even in grad school, I was like, shoot, I love free food. Like when they say free pizza at this conference, I'm like, oh, I'm there, because yeah, you gotta save money. But yeah, so active teens prefer getting free lunches. This tells you the first letter of all of these anterior pituitary hormones. So again, releasing hormones are from hypothalamus to pituitary, but once you have those releasing hormones activating endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary, they can produce any of these hormones. But again, which hormone is being produced? depends on which releasing hormone is being activating those endocrine cells. Now, this is also, there's many mnemonics, but I prefer this mnemonic. Why? Because it keeps FSH and LH together and they work together. So I think it's very important to keep them as a pair. And what do? Well, again, gonadotropin releasing hormones, so GnRH, stimulates FSH and LH production. So this is why in that mnemonic I like to keep them together, because these two hormones often work in concert. And they are both secreted by the anterior pituitary, and they target the female and male gonads. So it's not just the female gonad. Like if you've had biology or something talked about the menstrual cycle, you probably heard about FSH and LH. And we cover this more in detail at the end of the semester, but FSH and LH are right here. So there are many hormones involved in the menstrual cycle, but FSH and LH are very important, as you see here, especially that LH spike that triggers ovulation. But again, this is more downstream. You don't have to worry about all of this at this point. You can study it if you have time, but again, this is something I'm saving for the very end. But it's not just for the menstrual cycle. FSH and LH is also important in the male reproductive system. So why? Well, follicle stimulating hormone targets these cells, what we call Sertoli cells. And these are very important for sperm production. These are in the testes. And then LH is important for targeting these cells called Leydig cells. And these are very important in producing testosterone in the testes. So these are very important for reproductive health, not just for the menstrual cycle in females, but also in male reproduction as well. So basically what I'm getting at here is that FSH and LH disorders is not just exclusive to one sex, but if you have if you don't have enough of either hormone in either sex, then well, you're going to have fertility problems. Now, with thyroid stimulating hormone, what happens is that this stimulates thyroid hormone production, and we did talk about thyroid hormone. We'll talk more and more about this, kind of like building up little chunks of these thyroid hormone knowledge in your brain. But thyroid hormone affects almost every single cell in your body, because why? Well, there's receptors for thyroid hormone in pretty much every cell, or almost every cell in your body. And we'll get to that in another lecture coming up soon. Now ACTH, now I'm going to make a little push for this one. So ACTH, well, we have that releasing hormone being produced, that corticotropin releasing hormone being produced by the hypothalamus, and binds to these endocrine cells in the pituitary. So the cells that have receptors for CRH, they're going to produce ACTH. And this ACTH is going to be carried by the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands. And this is going to produce the production of glucocorticoid hormones. One of the main glucocorticoid hormones is cortisol. And it is a steroid because why? It has that 4-ring structure, the 3 hexagons and a pentagon. Now, this is so I'll end on this part. So this is the general adaptation syndrome, and we're talking about with this cascade right here, the amygdala sending signals to the hypothalamus via these nerve fibers, the hypothalamus sending signals along nerves to the adrenal glands and the adrenal medulla of the adrenal glands. This is all nerve fibers from this point to this point in the adrenal glands. And now you have the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are now in the bloodstream. But before the adrenal medulla, you had just nervous system. So this is the nervous system control of the nervous system part of the general adaptation syndrome. But in that ACTH, what we had is what we call the Hypothalamic-Pituitary Adrenal Axis, or the HPA Axis. So this is also part of the general adaptation syndrome. The hypothalamus is still involved in the endocrine control, but in addition to those nerve fibers, now you also have the release of corticotropin releasing hormone. And this CRH is going to bind to receptors on cells in the pituitary gland. These cells are going to produce ACTH, and this ACTH is going to target the adrenal glands, but a different part called the adrenal cortex. And this adrenal cortex is going to produce cortisol in response to binding ACTH. So some common structures in common, but compared to the previous example, this was all nervous system before. And different set of hormones, but with the HPA axis, maybe have the wiring between the amygdala and hypothalamus in common, but the linkage is not via neurons now. What we have are different levels and waves of hormones being released in sequence. And then you finally get a different type of hormone being produced from a different part of the adrenal gland. So this is the general adaptation syndrome and stress. You have cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine, but different ways of releasing those different hormones. And just for a little anatomy, so again, the adrenal gland, you have the capsule, but the cortex is the more outer, it's a little deeper to the capsule, but compared to the medulla is the innermost part. So actually, just like the cerebral cortex, that's the outer part of the brain, and the medulla of the brain is more of like the inner. We did have like the medulla oblongata, but compared to the cortex, it was more inner, right? Whenever you have an organ that has a cortex and medulla, the medulla is more inner, the cortex is more outer. Now with the cortex, what we had is that we had ACTH targeting cells in the cortex. And these cells in the adrenal cortex are going to produce cortisol. Whereas with the sympathetic activity of the general adaptation syndrome, we had those nerve fibers directly innervating and activating the cells in the adrenal medulla, and this produces a different set of hormones, the adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. So just showing you that you kind of have different ways that sometimes different cells produce different types of hormones, and there might be different ways of activating these different types of hormones. But in the case of general adaptation syndrome, we have two different ways of secreting all these hormones through both the nervous system and the endocrine system. Oof, ran over time. Okay, I'll save the rest for Friday's lecture. And prolactin. So prolactin, I talk more in detail when we talk about the reproductive system, especially when I talk about the mammary glands at the end of the semester. That's when I talk more about prolactin. But you should know at this point that it is important in milk production and mammary gland production. But actually, I do cover it a little more. But yeah, I cover it. I'll get to prolactin pretty soon, but I'll also cover it more at the end of the semester. I'll save it for Friday, all right? Okay, thanks for hanging on, everyone, and I'll see you on Friday. Take care until then. Stay healthy, please, because we don't want people, more case numbers getting kind of scary. But again, well, the good thing is that we haven't seen ICU beds fill up, so yeah, just try to stay healthy as much as possible, all right? Thanks to Mara Razor as well, and take care. See you on Friday.